Welcome to another episode of Summitcast. In this show, we're going to ask the question, why do people join the revolution? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. We're talking about revolutions again this week. And a few months ago, it seemed like we were seeing revolutions in the street in America.
Has it changed?
I think it's changed. Well, you know when I noticed it changed? After Don Lemon on CNN told everyone to stop because it was hurting the Democrats in the polls.
Oh, yeah. That's true.
Remember that?
Yeah. It was wise words.
Yeah. So the big question, of course, is what's going to happen on November 4th? Is it going to be revolution again in the streets?
Dun, dun, dun.
So I was watching an episode of Tim Pool, and he talked about, he was actually in Cairo when the revolution was happening there, with all the protests in Tahrir Square and everything, and police and tear gas and people getting shot and all that stuff. And he said, 2 streets away, there's a guy just sitting in a cafe watching the television. It's not, he said, it's not what you'd think. It's not like revolution everywhere. It's just happening in certain places. But then at those certain places, it can, key points, and they take over the Parliament building or something, and you've got to change your government.
Right. And so all the focus is there. That's what you're seeing is this hullabaloo that's going on in this very localized area, and then everyone else is just living their lives.
Yeah, but life is going on normally everywhere else. So that's kind of what it was like, a few months ago. There was, certain places where there was really, absolute chaos and riots and everything, revolution happening, and then everywhere else was, people were living their lives pretty normally. Anyway, the focus of this show is why do people join the revolution? And I've got an interesting article to talk about that. Have you ever heard of Eric Hoffer?
I've never heard of him.
He was a very interesting guy. He was an American philosopher, born in 1902, I think, in New York. And that's the story anyway. And when he was 5, his mother was carrying him. She fell downstairs and was injured and actually passed on 2 years later.
Wow.
When he was 7. And he went blind at that point. And he was blind from 7 to age 15.
Really?
When his sight just came back miraculously.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. And was there ever an explanation of what happened to his vision?
No. Well, actually, some people think the whole story of his early childhood is fiction.
It could be. It sounds kind of far-fetched. I mean, I don't know. Maybe medically, there's people who this has happened to. I've never heard of that happening, but
I could imagine it could happen, but whether it did in his case is another story.
The optic nerve suddenly grew back or something.
Oh, more likely a psychological thing. Like an intense trauma.
Yeah,
people have things like that happen with intense trauma.
Okay.
Anyway, at 15, he just started reading voraciously because he didn't know how long he had to read, so he just started reading books and books and books and books. And then when he was still pretty young, his father died, and he got $300 from the union and set off to the West Coast. And he was a kind of itinerant worker and, working. He said he used to split his time between the brothels and the library.
That's an interesting combination.
Yeah, everywhere he got a library card and he would just read.
Wow, okay.
And then in the 1940s, he tried to enlist in the military in World War II, but he got rejected because of medical conditions. So he signed up as a longshoreman.
And he would have been quite, if he was born
He would have been in his 40s.
Yeah, wow. But I guess he wanted to serve.
Everybody did.
Everyone,
It was really a different time.
It wasn't the same as we have now with Iraq and Afghanistan, where people are like, I'd rather not be involved in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was a fight for freedom.
Right.
Against the Nazis. That was really bad news. Anyway, he became a longshoreman and worked on the docks for 20 years. And in 1951, he published a book called The True Believer, which was just kind of, this guy came out of nowhere and he writes this incredible book, which is really, it was a book of philosophy. And the premise of the book is, why do people join mass movements?
Okay.
And he had some very interesting insights into that, very insightful. I mean, he'd obviously been reading a lot of stuff, obviously a really smart guy, and he started writing these notebooks, his observations. And one thing he observed that was very interesting was that, for example, in the 30s in Germany, you had two of these kind of revolutionary movements. You had the communists and you had the Nazis.
Okay.
And they would try to recruit members back and forth.
Right.
And the reason people joined both of them was the same.
Because you kind of, I mean, in history, we kind of think of the communists being completely, opposite of that. Like that the two were never, they hated each other, basically.
Yeah.
These two philosophies.
And it wasn't about the ideology.
Right.
But the movement met a need in people. And Hoffa has some very interesting things about that. I've got let me read you something. This is an article about him.
Okay.
Hoffa says that mass movements begin when discontented, frustrated, powerless people lose faith in existing institutions and demand change. Feeling hopeless, such people participate in movements that allow them to become part of a larger collective. They become true believers in a mass movement that appeals not to those intent on bolstering and advancing a cherished self, but to those who crave to be rid of an unwanted self because it can satisfy the passion for self-renunciation. Faith in a holy cause is to a considerable extent a substitute for the loss of faith in ourselves.
So you don't have faith in yourself, so you put your faith in this movement, in this outside.
Yeah, if your life doesn't have any meaning, you look for a meaning in being part of a collective.
Okay.
Because you don't have the sense of self-worth. He has a lot of really interesting things to say about this. And he says it's kind of the same whether they're religious, political movements, in any kind of mass movement where people join and they kind of give their identity over to the collective.
Yeah, because it sounds that he's kind of agnostic in the way he's approaching it. Not that it's like a religious movement, or it doesn't sound like he's differentiating.
Yeah, and he's in the book. He actually makes that point. It's not about the ideology. It's just there's common things that lead people to want to join a movement like this.
Okay.
One of the things he said is it's not so much the people who are oppressed that join the movements as the people who are bored.
We might have a serious abundance of bored people right about now.
That's
for the last 6 months or so.
Exactly. That's exactly. People are all stuck at home and not able to do anything, and so they're bored. And actually, I mean, the amazing thing is what Hoffa says is so insightful. Gives you such insight into what's happening in the world today, because what we're seeing actually he kind of predicted it, which is amazing. Writing in 1951.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And all these years later, it's still applicable. I guess. We've had mass movements throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia at this point. So I guess this follows that same pattern as any of them have. And he was just kind of tapping into the psychology or whatever, the ideologies behind that.
Yeah, he was able to take a look at an abstract level and see what was common amongst all of them, which is really quite an amazing thing to do. He could look past the ideology. Look past the Marxist ideology where these revolutionary movements start because of the pressure of the people on class warfare and so on. And he saw it's something actually very different from that.
Interesting.
Let me see. He says, the destitute are not usually converts to mass movements. They are too busy trying to survive to become engaged. But what Hoffa calls the new poor, those who previously had wealth or status but who believe they have now lost it, are potential converts. Such people are resentful and blame others for their problems. It's kind of a common theme, you see. Mass movements also attract the partially assimilated, those who feel alienated from the mainstream culture. And of course, with COVID lockdowns, everyone is feeling alienated. There's no point of connection.
Well, I think the crazy levels of division that we have in society also makes everyone feel alienated from each other. You don't really know how to express your opinions one way or the other. Are you going to lose a friend because you say one of the 100 things that make another person upset?
Could be offensive, yeah.
One way or the other. There's so many different ways that you can upset people now that you feel like you don't have anywhere to turn to, and so maybe in private, you then would kind of lean towards moving towards some kind of mass movement, or finding a group of people that don't think you're so crazy.
Yeah, and you just kind of you just abandon your own ideas and ideals, and you just adopt the cause, and it's kind of like you can lead a heroic life,
Right.
by being part of a cause, and bringing in the utopia, or saving the world, or saving the nation, or whatever it is, whatever the cause is.
Right. Yeah, which is interesting. So they're kind of losing themselves in this battle for some greater good that they believe that they're a part of.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a desire for self-renunciation, and he says it comes from people who haven't got a sense of self-worth in their lives. One thing he says is very interesting. It's like an antidote to it is actually productive work, actually to have a job and earn a living.
Okay.
He likens that to a rite of passage, which you have in primitive cultures. There were rites of
Right.
passage. Actually, this is a whole other subject, which is rites of passage from childhood to adulthood.
Okay.
And there's a very interesting book by Robert Bly called Iron John, where he talks about this.
Iron John.
Iron John, yeah.
Okay.
Very interesting book. And he talks about a thing that is really missing in society today is these rites of passage from childhood to adulthood. So we have this kind of strange thing which is called teenage, which is neither child nor adult.
Right.
And it's kind of extending through later and later
When
into
your voice is still
into the
cracking.
20s.
And you're
Well, no, beyond that, when you're no longer kind of responsible member of society,
right. Yeah.
See, in a tribal society, you're a child, and then when you reach puberty or thereabouts, you go away with the elders, and they take you through these secret initiation rites, and you come back and you're an adult. There isn't this kind of neither thing in the middle.
Now I'm a man. Now I'm an adult. Now I'm
Exactly,
Right.
And, the bar mitzvah in Judaism is kind of, the remnant of that.
right.
And confirmation in Christianity is even a more stepped-down version. And he's...
Quinceañera. I know in Spanish culture, quinceañera for the girls is very kind of popular.
And he says the way these rites of passage work in tribal societies is that the adult men take the boys and initiate them into adulthood. It's not the father. The father can't do it.
Interesting.
But then when you see, Robert Bly says when you look at what's happening in American cities, in the black communities, for example, where there are no men around,
Right.
then there's no one to initiate the young men into adulthood. And so he says it gets very ugly when they try to do that themselves, and that's what the gangs are. You have your tests of courage and things you have to do in order to get initiated into the gang, and it's like a rite of passage. But it's not a very productive one.
Right, because it's just other poorly adjusted youth that are trying to...
They're trying to figure it out themselves
yeah.
without any adult guidance,
Right.
And it doesn't turn out well. It turns into, Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, I don't actually know that reference.
You don't know that reference? Oh, it's a film.
Okay.
You ought to watch it sometime. It's a really interesting film.
Okay.
It's about these a group of young boys that get marooned on an island by themselves with no adults, and it turns into this really ugly scene. And then, just right at the end, before they're about to kill one of the other boys,
Spoilers.
spoiler alert. Anyway, I won't tell you everything. But yeah, he says that's what you see with this gang culture. And so you kind of, the same thing is missing, the rite of passage is missing here. And Hoffa says that in modern society, it's in a sense getting a job and earning a living. It's when you become a responsible adult and your life has meaning because of the work you do.
Right.
And I think that's another reason why we're seeing this kind of people willing to join the revolution, because they don't have jobs.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I know in one of my classes in college, there was a girl who had. So I was in my 20s. I went to school later, and she was 18, and she had gotten her first job, and she saw the taxes coming out of her paycheck,
Yeah.
and she was so indignant. Like she was like, "Wait, I have to pay for all this stuff?" like I think you could watch this like becoming an adult,
Yeah.
regardless of your tax philosophy
Yeah.
in life. It was just her understanding that responsibility, that yes, society has cost. If you want to have free public education for everyone, and roads that are drivable and all these things, they have costs, and you get the opportunity to pay for it. And she was so upset, and it was just funny.
Wait a
for
minute, that's my money.
That's my money. It's not your money. So us few adults that were in the course were having a pretty good laugh over it, because we had already learned those lessons of having a job and seeing how you become a productive member of the society. That you gain that responsibility, that level of responsibility, that we're working together on building it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I see is a major problem in society is that the point where people do that is getting delayed further and further and further. I mean, it used to be when people went to college, they would get jobs in over the summer, or even during the semester, they get a part-time job and earn some money, and that's how they'd support themselves. Now they get student loans.
Yeah.
And so the point where they actually earn money can be well into the 20s.
Yeah, right.
And it's a lot harder to go through that kind of psychological change of responsibility when you're older than when you're younger.
Yeah.
I mean, the Montessori thing is there's a sensitive period for certain things where the brain is developing in a certain way, and the experiences in life help the brain to kind of solidify to the next level of maturity.
Okay.
And if you go through life and you don't have those experiences at that time, then rather than kind of a natural process which is in alignment with how the brain is developing, it becomes something you can learn, but you have to learn it consciously.
Okay.
It's like trying to learn a language when you're an
Right,
adult.
exactly.
It's a whole different process if you're learning a language when you're 2.
Right. Yeah. Like my son trying to learn Russian.
But he's learning English, right?
He's learning both, actually, which,
Yeah.
I mean, he'll tell Papa, I'll say, give Papa a kiss. But I say it in Russian, and he gives me a kiss. So he clearly is learning both. But it's just, it's still funny because he definitely prefers English to Russian.
He's living in America. Good for him.
I really try. I
Yeah.
want him to learn Russian, so
Yeah.
so we're working on it. But yeah, it's funny. Machina versus car. It's one's a little bit easier than the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing about learning a language when you're a kid, you just kind of do it effortlessly because that's what your brain is designed to do at that age.
Yeah.
If you try to learn it as an adult, you've got to study it, you've got to practice it, and you can get it wired into your brain by a process of hard work and conscious effort, whereas it kind of happens unconsciously and easily at a different age. So the same thing with this kind of passage into adulthood. By delaying people's passage into adulthood, we're actually kind of really interfering long term with the development of their brain and their sense of self.
That's interesting. I actually did one of these work study programs when I was still in high school. So I had a job at a grocery store when I was 15, I think, and we would go to work for 2 hours a day, and then we would come back, and they had a class, and I think it was, now that I look at it, I think it was more for the delinquent children, which I wasn't. I was just kind of bored in school, but this was a way to kind of.
But that's a great antidote for that.
Right.
You're doing something productive in life, and
Yeah,
you're getting
absolutely.
paid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I got like $100 a week or something crazy. As a 14-year-old, just to take 2 hours out of my day, and it was actually it was a really good experience because I think I also got to interact with adults and with people this was their life. They were doing this as a job and living that life. So I think it helped me to kind of develop in that way, that I had this level of responsibility, and
I bet it also gave you the sense that you've had ever since, that wherever you were, you felt like you could support yourself, you could get a job.
Right. Yeah. That you'll be able to make it.
Yeah. I had the same thing. I worked like I kind of had a few jobs in high school over the vacation, summer holidays. But then when I was at university, I started doing tutoring for high school students. I would charge what was a really good rate of pay then, and I would arrange the jobs. And I realized looking back that it gave me the sense that wherever I was, I could make it. I could earn a living. I could do something that was valuable. And it gave a kind of a sense of security. And I think if people miss out on that, then they're much more likely to want to say, let the government look after me, because they don't have the sense they could do it themselves.
Or, I mean, to tie this back into this idea of joining the revolution, that you don't have that faith in yourself to be able to provide, and so you feel like you need to give up yourself and join this cause, or leave yourself behind.
Yeah,
that you're not worth pursuing.
Yeah, exactly. It's the lack of self-worth. You find meaning in your life in this mass movement you're part of. Mm-hmm. So I think what you see there is really it's the antidote to a kind of a really negative and unproductive revolution, which we may be heading to. Is I think the whole system of student loans needs to be totally rethought. Yeah. It's a long-term goal, but I think it's really, really necessary just for the health of society and the health of the youth.
Oh yeah.
And
the cost of education is just absurd.
Yeah. Well, that's another aspect that the whole student loan thing is totally distorted.
Right.
There's no real cost to to education. It's just it's just on the loan, and at that age, people are taking out these loans and they don't have any idea really what it would mean to pay it back,
or how long it will take to pay it back. Yeah, especially even at the low interest rates that they charge on student loans. I mean, it's still a significant. I know people that are my age, 35, that are still paying off student loans.
I mean, it's a tremendous burden for many years of their life, where they should be able to be saving money and buying a house or something like that,
Right.
And they can't start doing that until they're 40, which is just, they're so far behind.
Right. And their kids, or if they even have already had kids, their kids are already 10 years old or more by the time they're even buying a home.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the whole system's been skewed.
Yeah. Something I noticed is, when in the first round of the global financial crisis, 2008, one of the things they did as a kind of antidote was to encourage people to go to college, to solve the unemployment problem. But I think long term it was probably a really bad strategy.
Yeah, because they were not useful degrees, or?
Well, they weren't doing useful work. They were just getting money for nothing.
Okay, so they didn't actually value the education. They didn't.
Yeah. It's more than that. They weren't actually earning money, which is an important thing. It was delaying their transition to adulthood and becoming responsible adults.
Right.
So you raised a generation to be actually what Hoffa talks about as the corrupting influence of wealth without labour. If you just get wealth without putting anything out, karmically it's imbalanced, right?
Right. Yeah, you always have to think. That's like with the getting the money from the unemployment in the last 6 months or so. I think at some point I was like, I don't really need this. I stopped taking it. I was just like, I'm done. I don't need to take this anymore. And then I felt karmically like, okay, we're beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it actually has effects spiritually on the soul, I think, as far as the soul development. The other thing that happens is he talks about is that it's the affluent who tend to join these movements rather than the poor, the working people. Working people tend to join these movements.
They're too busy working.
They're working, and their life has meaning. But the children of the rich who are just at university and studying and not having to do anything to earn a living, life doesn't have any meaning. So they're looking for something to give their life meaning, and so they join these kind of movements. And that's kind of typically the joke about these people who are in Antifa. They're from upper middle class backgrounds with nice educations and good futures ahead of them. And why are they calling for the whole system that gave them what they have to be overthrown?
Right.
It's not logical.
Right.
but
It reflects on their lack of self-worth for themselves, I think.
yeah. And, when you look at it from the point of view of the psychology that Hoffa talks about, it makes perfect sense. What Hoffa suggested is an interesting thing. He said, he suggested that the need for meaningful work as a rite of passage into adulthood could be fulfilled with a 2-year civilian national service program, like the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. This is a quote: "The routinization of the passage from boyhood to manhood would contribute to the solution of many of our pressing problems. I cannot think of any other undertaking that would dovetail so many of our present difficulties into opportunities for growth." So I think there's, a program like that would have been much more useful than just encouraging more people to go to university.
Yeah.
Some countries, they have a universal military service.
Right. I was thinking that. I know
They would do the same thing.
Israel and
Israel does.
Norway, I believe, also.
Probably Switzerland too. Again, it's a right of you do your
2 years or
you
whatever.
do your 2 years.
Or 1 year, I think. Sweden. I have a friend who in Sweden, and he had mandatory service, and it was 1 year.
Yeah, and it's a rite of passage into adulthood.
Right.
I mean, the Mormons have it.
Do they? Oh, right, with their mission.
The mission.
Right,
you go out and do your 2-year mission, and you're independent from your parents, and you're out, and it's not a paid position, but it's a rite of passage, and I'm sure people come back very different.
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, those life change. I mean, those life experiences would definitely.
Yeah.
And theoretically, they would have people around them that would, like you're saying, taking the boy off into the forest to go, fight the lion and come back a man. Perhaps they have a system to guide them through that.
I think that, they're always placed with the local church with a good support structure around them. They have exactly that, which I think is a really important part of the success of the program.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the men and that it can't be the father that does this initiation process, it kind of I've had people. My father died when I was 2, so I've had people who have inadvertently made comments about people who grow up without a father being having difficulties as adults in society, and so I really kind of looked in. Why am I reasonably well adjusted in society? I'm not in prison. I have a wife and child, and I think it is that I had this community of men around me. That would change as time went on. But life always seemed to provide a different kind of one or two or a few male figures that kind of helped me at that point in my development, that I was able to talk to and learn from, to grow in those different stages. So I think that it's incredibly important to find those and to develop that in our communities.
And perhaps what it is, it's not so much the lack of the father in the home, but the father is the point of contact for the child with the other adult men in the community.
Okay.
Maybe that's what it is.
Right. That's how. I mean, otherwise it's difficult to be, introduced to a group of men that can help you or.
Yeah, because who does your mother introduce you to?
Right. Well, and some of those have been. I mean, she had a couple of boyfriends that were kind of, I would say, helpful through that process.
Mm-hmm. Well, your mother's boyfriends or other relationships, is definitely someone who could play that role if they choose.
Right. Even though they weren't father. Yeah. Exactly. Well, we can leave that behind. Leave that alone.
They all have something to offer.
They all had something to offer. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you have to find those. How do you promote that in society on a grander scale? Would it be, when you talk about military, I've had several friends who've been in the Army and Air Force and whatnot, and they kind of universally say that it's different than what they thought it would be. That they kind of went into it in this kind of righteous, kind of protector or defender of America kind of ideal. And when they actually got there, they found that it was a lot of boys with big toys, it was, kind of children. It was 18-year-olds who had been given control of, giant
tanks.
Hummers and tanks and, just like blowing things up. And and so there was kind of that.
But you should have some officers around to keep it, to help them
And maybe that happens in different, in special ops or in somewhere where there's maybe a tighter knit group versus just being general infantry or whatever. But I wonder if that's just an ideal that we have of the military, and it's not realistic. I don't know.
I don't know. I've never really been in the military, but I did Air Force cadets in high school. But
Okay.
I wouldn't really count that as military.
More than me. I just redneck family, and we would go shooting guns. So that's about my.
That's another rite of passage, learning to shoot.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
When you talk about that, when I was 7 years old, it was like me and my grandfather and my uncles. And I think it was all men. I think the women were back. It was during Thanksgiving, and we would go out into the woods and take all the guns and go shoot at things and just have fun. And that was, I think the first time I'd ever shot a shotgun, and of course, and I'm sure lots of people at 7 years old, they would be terrified to hear that I was shooting a gun. But in Oklahoma, that was just, it's that cowboy culture. Everyone has guns and everyone shoots. And that was definitely kind of a rite of initiation, a rite of passage.
It's exactly what it was. It was your grandfather and uncles.
Yep.
And they took you out alone, away from your mother, into the forest, and you learn how to hunt.
Yes, exactly.
You can't get much more archetypal rite of passage than that.
Absolutely. And it was a blast. And I've loved guns ever since. And I think that's kind of, if we ever want to get into that conversation, the respect that has to be given for guns, because it was all done very kind of safely and with the understanding of this being a tool that can be used and done in a proper way. Whereas when you see like these mass shootings, you don't have those proper father figures and male figures around these kids, and then they just don't have any control over their emotions. They get upset. They go steal the guns and they go, commit these terrible atrocities.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have that kind of loving environment to be shown the ultimate power of these tools.
Yeah, and they had a life that was meaningless, and this is something that could give meaning to their life.
Yeah, exactly. Which is just absolutely terrifying. And unfortunate that we as society couldn't reach them. That there wasn't a friend or two that was in their life that would have been able to do that. I think that's the power of friendship, that you can intervene in people's lives and help them, and they can help you when you're going through something.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when you look at these problems, there's things that the government needs to do differently, but it's mostly kind of getting out of the way, and it really does come back to one by one, individual by individual. Looking for a government program to solve these things, it isn't going to work. Although Civilian Conservation Corps actually kind of like that idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting. They built lots of things back in the 30s and dams and all of these cool projects that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And something like that could work these days. I think it's sad to say. I think it's better than going to university these days in terms of the soul development.
Well, and I'm sure you would learn, useful skills.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah.
That you get for free. You wouldn't even be going to school for it. Because
you're getting paid.
Right.
Not a big wage, but you're actually getting paid. I remember there was a really interesting quote from Andy Warhol. Who was this artist who would get millions of dollars for a painting of a Campbell's soup can just because he was Andy Warhol and he was famous. He said that he was actually happier when he was a commercial artist and drawing shoes for advertisements.
Drawing shoes.
He'd get like $50 for a shoe.
Okay.
And you knew exactly how much your shoe was worth. You do it $50 and you get pay do the shoe, get paid $50. You knew what you were worth.
Right.
But when you're famous and just getting money for nothing, there's no sense of self-worth.
Perceived value is so out of whack,
Yeah, so there's no sense of self-worth, Am I just a fraud that someone's paying me $50 million? A great sense of uneasiness about that.
Right. I hear lots of people say how actors and actresses are so kind of mentally handicapped in that, and I wonder if that's part of it, is that because their performance is so subjective, that some people love it, some people hate it, and they don't really have an easy way to value their output and their worth.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's exactly that. If they actually just started working for minimum wage, stocking shelves. It's good for the soul.
Absolutely, I loved it. I worked in a factory for a year and a half, and it was terrible, and it was wonderful. You know, it was because you really were just working. You know, every day. It was a overnight shift, and it was every night, I should say, and it really provided kind of that foundation for my life. Even though, you know, half of the guys there were on drugs, it was, you know, it was very kind of solidifying in my psyche.
Yeah, I think that's what these kind of experiences, I think, is what's missing. And, you know, short term, we have a problem with violence in the streets and riots, and, you know, where that's going to lead, especially after the election. But long term, you know, there are some major problems in society that need to be addressed, and I don't know how you address them apart from starting to talk about them.
Yeah, I think, and having relationships. I think having relationships with people again. We're in such a digital era where everything is, you know, social media is so real for everyone, and it's so fake. The reality is that it's so unreal, and it doesn't create bonding, long-lasting relationships.
It's a very superficial bonding.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's another thing. So, you know, we need to get past COVID, you know, so people can start
being together
again. And they can start, and, you know, the economy needs to get back on track. I mean, what was good about before COVID was the unemployment was very low, especially in the black community and so on. So that was actually a really positive. Things were heading in a very positive direction there.
Right. So hopefully we can get back to that, and
hopefully
get people to work and help them understand their point in society.
Exactly.
But I just wonder if we're kind of painting this in a negative light, this idea of the mass movement. I mean, is there a way that mass movements can be good? I mean, you know, it seems like kind of this discussion has been kind of negative on mass movement. It's just a bunch of people who are out of work and lazy, sitting around and don't feel good about themselves, so they go join a mass movement. But when is that a positive thing in society?
I don't know if Eric Hoffer talks about that. But,
oh, really?
But here are my thoughts about it. If you look at maybe the American Revolution, you know, I don't think that was. I mean, certainly people who are leading it, they weren't coming from a point of view of their lives were meaningless. Mm-hmm. These were people who were very well educated and had, you know, were very accomplished, had, you know, deeply thought about things, and had a real spiritual philosophy underlying what they were doing. Freemasons, among other things. So it wasn't in one sense, it wasn't really a mass movement, but it was it was a large movement of people who had very clear idealistic goals that they wanted to achieve.
Maybe the definition is what's kind of throwing us off, is that the mass movement being kind of a negative term, that it's that we're just together, that there's no real reason for being together other than wanting to be part of something. Yeah.
I guess that's the negative sense of the mass movement, is people who don't have any sense of individual identity and trying to find a substitute. But you could also have a movement where there's people who have a very strong sense of identity and a clear goal, who join together because they can do more together than they can apart.
Sure.
And that's possibly the model of the American Revolution.
Okay.
And, you know, from a spiritual perspective, you could say it's kind of based on individual Christhood and the internalization of that. And if people don't have it, they look for it. They look for the external savior. They look for the Christ, you know, the savior figure outside. But if you have that sense of the divinity within, the real self, you know, the spiritual self.
Right. The answers are coming from within versus from some outside person, or, you know.
And then you can join with other people with a like ideal, and you know, have a tremendously powerful movement to change the world. I mean, you look at early Christianity too. You know, Jesus and the 12 apostles. I mean, these were not people with a lack of identity. These were very strong people,
right?
Who you know, got together and changed the world.
Right. Gautama in the same way. You know, he was a prince. He was pretty high up.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe he was the same. He was a beatnik.
He had the curse of unearned wealth.
Exactly. So he had a bunch of time to go sit under a tree and become enlightened,
Yeah,
or sit in a cave. Yeah.
yeah. But I think you're right. I think that's part of the solution is the mass movement of the people who do have that sense of spiritual destiny, a spiritual vision, and a spiritual mission. And I know you're out there. So tune in next week for our next show, and look for opportunities to make a difference in the world. Anything you want to say to close?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, we'll see you next week.